I'll be the first to admit that I have a very strange hobby. As you've probably been able to tell by now, I have an intense fascination with the paranormal. Ghosts, monsters, aliens, claims of bizarre powers or events. I love talking about them, researching them, analyzing evidence, and trying to determine if any of these bizarre claims might be real. When I'm not working, I'm browsing internet forums, or newspaper records, or reading books on a whole slew of weird topics. And yes, I have always been like this. Why? Well, I grew up on a healthy diet of Monster of the Week content. Watching old VHS tapes of Scooby-Doo and the real Ghostbusters as a kid turned into streaming episodes of The X-Files, and then more documentary-like shows such as Monster Quest or Destination Truth. Reading scary stories with a flashlight under my blankets evolved into long hours reading eyewitness accounts online and newspaper clippings at the public library. But I think the biggest contributor to my weird little hobby has to be the town that I grew up in. It's a Civil War town, and everywhere you look you will find antebellum homes, Civil War monuments, museums, and even a military park dedicated to the town's tragic past. History knows it as the key to the South, a decisive turning point that gave the Union the upper hand in winning the Civil War. I know it as the most haunted town in Mississippi, a place where there's a ghost story waiting around every single corner. And today, I'd like to share some with you. This is Legend Has It. I'm your host, Michael Walker, and the legends about Vicksburg just might be true. The Natchez had lived there for centuries before the French arrived. Before then, it was a beautiful landscape filled with walnut and magnolia trees and small rivers branching off of the mighty Mississippi. In 1719, French colonizers built Fort St. Pierre along the Yazoo River, one of those many tributaries that connected to the Mississippi, in an effort to move into the area and block off the British. It was a large, hulking structure that gave the French some claim over the area. The first couple of years were pretty peaceful, at least as far as the French were concerned. They even began expanding their claim over the area and growing crops and trading with the local Native Americans. That is, until 1729. Tensions had begun to rise between the French and the Natchez people over the decade that the French lived in the area, with them steadily trying to claim more and more land that belonged to the Native Americans. This would lead to the Natchez leading an attack at Fort St. Pierre, and the fort was abandoned. The area changed ownership several times over the next couple of years, but was eventually incorporated as a town following the American Revolution. It was named Vicksburg after a Methodist minister who lived there named Nuit Vic. As the years went on, Vicksburg became a pretty major port city, where goods would be shipped to and from its docks on the Mississippi River, and railroads connected the town to the rest of the state. But I mentioned that Vicksburg is famous for its involvement in the Civil War, the notorious clash between the Union and Confederacy that left roughly 620,000 people dead. Mississippi was the second state to secede from the Union, strongly taking an anti-abolitionist stance that defied the northern states and the new president, Abraham Lincoln, who fought to prevent the creation of new slave states as the country continued to expand. Having been raised in Mississippi, I've heard the argument that the Civil War wasn't just about slavery, and to an extent that is true. If you examine the Articles of Succession that the Confederate States had written up, they list things such as Union states not complying with constitutional obligations, a disapproval of the election of Abraham Lincoln and his policies, a lack of federal aid in dealing with criminals, and so on and so forth. But a large number of complaints against the Union regarded the ownership of slaves. In fact, in Mississippi's Article of Succession, it was the first point made in their argument for leaving the Union, stating right at the top of the document, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery." When the Civil War broke out, a huge focus for the Union was gaining control of the Mississippi River, as it provided a way to travel through the Confederate territory, and Vicksburg stood directly in their way. General and future President Ulysses S. Grant tried to overtake the city once, but found that the city's defenses were too strong and he had to backtrack and try again. And this time, he had a plan. After months of taking out smaller Confederate bases in the area, Grant was able to completely block off the town of Vicksburg. The siege lasted for 47 days. During those 47 days, the town was ceaselessly barraged with cannon fire, and many families had to move into man-made caves to survive the onslaught. Supplies dwindled, causing many people to resort to eating horses, dogs, and even rats. And a few houses in the area had to be converted into Confederate hospitals. The Confederate soldiers trapped in Vicksburg fought back as hard as they could, but in the end, the struggle proved too much for them, and General John C. Pemberton, the leader of the Confederate forces in Vicksburg, officially surrendered on July 4th, 1863. I know that's a lot of history to digest all at once, but Vicksburg's legacy is directly tied to its history as a Civil War battleground. It's the very thing that put the town into the history books, that one devastating loss that was put on a pedestal for all the world to see. The siege had a strong effect on Vicksburg, and remnants of it can still be seen today. There are old houses close to the waterfront that still have cannonballs embedded in their walls. Trenches still exist in untouched parts of the town where Confederates would have fired back at Union soldiers. Rumor has it that many people in Vicksburg didn't celebrate the 4th of July for years after Pemberton's surrender, and many, let's call them proud Southerners who lived there, still chastise Pemberton for being a coward and a traitor. But on top of all of this, some say there is one more reminder of the town's tragic history. They think that all of the pain and the suffering and loss that Vicksburg suffered through during the Civil War left behind something even darker. In places all over the city, people have reported strange encounters, unsettling visions, and things they just can't explain. They claim to see ghosts. As you pull up to the Duff Green Mansion, the first thing you notice is that it is absolutely massive. It has 3 stories plus an attic with ceilings that rise 15 feet in the air. Add the tall columns, the huge front porch, the lavish decor, and the extravagant parlor rooms all on top of that, and you just know that this house belonged to someone extremely wealthy. And extremely wealthy Mr. Duff Green was. Green was in the business of selling cotton, a very lucrative position in the South, and he had the mansion erected in 1856 as a wedding gift for his new bride, Mary. Duff and Mary were famous around town for their parties. On the 2nd floor, there is a gentleman's parlor and a ladies' parlor, where the respective parties would gossip among themselves for a while before they moved across the hall into the game room. This is where the party would really come alive, and the upper elite of Vicksburg would drink and play games and dance the night away. Duff and Mary lived this charming life for years before the Union began firing cannons upon the town. In a bid to keep them from destroying their mansion, Duff and Mary offered up the home as a hospital. Both Union and Confederate soldiers were treated there, and by treated I really mean they had their limbs amputated. The bullets that shot through these poor soldiers were usually teeming with bacteria, and in order to keep an infection from spreading to the rest of the body, doctors would simply remove the infected limb. These severed arms and legs would be tossed out the window into the yard, often creating piles of appendages that rose several feet high before they were removed. And these painful surgeries were happening around the clock, every single day. Mary gave birth to a son while she and Duff lived in a nearby man-made cave, and she named him, quite fittingly, William Siege Green. They had another child a few years later after the siege had ended, a little girl named Annie, but Annie died when she was only 6 years old. Duff would soon follow her, passing away in 1880, and Mary would sell their beloved mansion later that year. In the years since, the Duff Green Mansion has been a private residence, most notably being the home of Newitt Vick's great-granddaughter, as well as an orphanage, a home for elderly widows, and a station for the Salvation Army. Today it stands as a bed and breakfast, much like other historic homes in Vicksburg, open to travelers and history buffs alike, and it's here that most of the stories about the mansion come from. It would seem that the Greens loved their mansion so much they decided they would never leave. Guests and caretakers over the years claim to have had run-ins with a man in 1800s business apparel, or a blonde woman in a green dress, and they believe it to be the man and lady of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Duff Green. They only catch a glimpse of the spirit for a few seconds before they disappear into thin air. Their daughter Annie also seems to have stayed behind. Guests have seen the visage of a little girl in a white dress running around the lower floors of the inn, giggling and bouncing a ball up and down on the floor. If you enter the main parlor of the hotel, on the bottom floor underneath the giant front porch, there's a guest room in the back right corner of the room. This is where most guests claim to have seen the ghost of the young girl, which kind of makes sense. The room, labeled Little Annie, is named after her, after all. And the lore of the Duff Green Mansion and its spirits aren't just confined to the house. Directly across the street is a 2-story brick home. It's a private house now, but during the siege of Vicksburg, it was where the nurses who worked in Duff Green Mansion would live. In order to keep the nurses safe, soldiers were stationed inside the house to guard them. And legend says that every now and then, guests will see a man in Confederate uniform staring out at them from the windows of this house. But the most chilling story about the mansion, at least in my opinion, is of the soldier in the Dixie Room. The Dixie Room is the room right next door to the Little Annie, and during the siege its primary function was as an operating room, where soldiers underwent those bloody surgeries to amputate their limbs. In it, guests have reported waking up in the middle of the night to find a stranger in their room, often sitting in one of the chairs and staring at them, as if he's trying to figure out what they're doing there. It's a man dressed in a Confederate uniform. The guests will try to call for help, of course, but before they can, the man disappears right before their very eyes. Several guests have reported meeting this phantom stranger over the years, and each time they include a singular odd detail. A detail which is pretty chilling when you consider the room's tragic past. This Confederate soldier is missing one of his legs. On the other side of town from Duff Green, you will find a beautiful Greek Revival home on Oak Street, known as the Cedar Grove Mansion. This mansion was also erected as a wedding present, this time by a man named John Alexander Klein. Klein was a businessman from Virginia who came to the bustling port city of Vicksburg in order to expand his businesses. From what I've read, he had his hand in a number of occupations, from growing cotton and lumber to jewelry making and even banking. In 1840, he would meet the love of his life, a girl named Elizabeth Bartley Day. Never mind that at the time they met, she was 15 and he was pushing 30. They didn't really have misgivings about that sort of thing in the 1800s. The two were married in 1842, and while they waited for their new home to be built, the two went on an extended honeymoon in Europe, purchasing many expensive gifts for themselves that they would use to adorn their home. When the couple returned, they had the workers implement these furnishings into their new home, such as a French gaselier, a chandelier-like fixture that would have used gas instead of candles, and fireplaces crafted out of beautiful Italian marble. The construction took 10 whole years, but the Kleins finally moved into the mansion in 1852 and tried to start a family. Then, as I'm sure you can guess, the Civil War came along and ruined everything. John joined the Confederate troops in their bid to fight back the Union forces, but Elizabeth stayed behind, and she might have been in just as dangerous a situation as John was. See, Elizabeth was related to one William T. Sherman, one of the Union generals leading the campaign to overtake Vicksburg, and this made her a target for jeers and insults from her neighbors. And on top of this, she was pregnant. Sherman snuck Elizabeth behind Union lines in order to deliver her child, and both Elizabeth and her newborn son survived the ordeal. Graciously, Elizabeth named her son William Tecumseh Sherman Klein, in honor of him. Elizabeth, William, and John returned to their home following the Civil War, Save for a few stray cannonballs, the house remained intact, since, much like Duff Green, it was also used as a field hospital in order to prevent it from being fired upon. Things were finally returning to normal, but while the war was over, tragedy would still loom over Cedar Grove. John and Elizabeth lost 4 of their children over the years. Their first child, a daughter named Ava, died at the age of 2. Another child, a boy named Harry, died when he was only 2 months old, and another son named Frank died of illness a few years after that. The last child the Kleins lost was their son William. When William was 17, he was returning home from a hunting trip with a friend. As he was climbing the steps to the back door, his gun went off by accident, fatally wounding him. He died right there on the back steps of the house. John Klein also passed away while he was living at Cedar Grove. Elizabeth later sold the house, and it became a private residence for a while. According to the stories, one of the people who owned the house was a doctor, and this doctor had a sister who stayed with them for a while. This sister struggled with depression. She was so prone to extreme episodes that she wasn't allowed near dangerous objects such as knives, and often needed someone to watch over her to make sure she wasn't a threat to herself. However, one day she lost her fight with her mental illness and ended up shooting herself in the ballroom. The house is an inn now, but some guests who visit think of it as a snapshot of history, where the home's horrific past replays itself on an endless loop. There's a gravesite in the corner of the yard where John Klein and his children were buried. However, when Elizabeth sold the house, John, William, and Frank were removed from their graves and reburied in Cedar Hill Cemetery, and some locals think that disturbing the graves upset their spirits. Take, for example, the guest room that used to be the nursery, where guests claim to hear the sound of a baby crying even when the room is empty. This is the same room where Ava and Harry passed away. John and Elizabeth have both been seen wandering around the house, and guests have also reported seeing a young girl who they think is John and Elizabeth's daughter. Since Elizabeth lived longer than the rest of her family, visitors to the house have also claimed to see an older woman in grieving clothes wandering around Cedar Grove. And they've also seen William going up and down the staircase in the backyard. And then there's the case of that woman who killed herself in the ballroom. Guests have reported seeing her too, of course, but they've also reported something else. Some people have stood in that room, admiring the view and the beautiful period furnishings, when they're suddenly startled by a loud noise coming from right behind them, as if it came from the center of the room. And they all claim that it sounds like a gunshot. It's difficult to describe just how big Cedar Hill Cemetery is. If you were to stand on one side of the graveyard, you cannot see all the way to the other side. It's just a massive, endless plot of rolling hills, magnolia trees, mausoleums, and tombstones. Some of these graves date back to the early 1800s, some even before the Civil War, and people continue to be buried there today. Situated almost in the middle of the cemetery is a group of 5,000 graves dedicated to Confederate soldiers, and it's in this collection of headstones that we find a monument to Douglas. Douglas and others like him were brought over from Africa to be a part of a special cavalry operation that Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederate States, was putting together. Douglas was tough as nails. He helped the Confederate troops in the Battle of Iuka and the Battle of Corinth before being stationed in Vicksburg during the siege, and it's here that he met his untimely end. Douglas unwittingly wandered into enemy lines by mistake, where he was killed by a Union sharpshooter. He was dead before he hit the ground. The troop that Douglas was a part of, the 43rd Mississippi Infantry, were absolutely enraged, and a small group of soldiers were sent out to kill the sharpshooter. Once he was dead, Douglas's fellow soldiers found themselves in a very difficult situation. They were in the middle of a siege after all. Supplies were almost non-existent, and they were running low on food. According to local legend, they ate Douglas. They stripped the meat from his bones, they cooked it over a fire, and they ate him. As gruesome as it sounds, and it was gruesome, don't get me wrong, I don't think the soldiers had much trouble with their decision to eat Douglas. See, Douglas wasn't a Confederate soldier. He wasn't even human. Douglas was a camel, one of about 75 camels and dromedaries that made up the U.S. Camel Corps. Back in the 1830s, as the United States tried expanding southwest across the continent, they ran into a problem. That problem being that a lot of the areas they traveled through were very arid and dry, and many horses used to transport explorers were dying from dehydration. So, a proposition was made to import camels from Africa to help with the expansion efforts instead. The idea was originally rejected, but when it became apparent that soldiers were needed to occupy these new settlements in the southwest, the War Department accepted the idea and imported camels from Africa all the way to Texas, which is how Old Douglas made his way to the States. There aren't any stories of a phantom camel shambling through Washington Street at night. Believe me, I've checked. But the story of Douglas and his memorial does add an interesting flavor to a town already teeming with both history and urban legends. Vicksburg is filled with eerie little Easter eggs like this. You just have to know where to look for them. If you travel outside the city limits and into the more rural parts of Vicksburg, you will find Go Wall Road, the site of an eerie, long-abandoned church, and a graveyard with weather-worn tombstones. Go Wall Road has its own ghost stories too. According to the locals, if you travel through there late at night, you might catch a glimpse of a troop of Confederate ghosts marching through the woods. Then there's the National Military Park, where you can find over 1,300 memorials dedicated to the soldiers who died in the Civil War. If you're ever there, make sure you visit the Pennsylvania Memorial, also affectionately known as the Bleeding Faces. It's a granite structure decorated with 5 bronze busts depicting the faces of Captain George W. Durrell, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas S. Brinholtz, Colonel John F. Hartramp, Colonel Daniel Leisure, and Colonel John I. Curtin in honor of their service. Apparently, when it rains, the rainwater will mix with red flecks of rust from the memorials, making it look as if the faces are crying blood. Then there's the abandoned playground on Wisconsin Avenue. It's a relic, all but forgotten, in the woods behind New Mount Elam Church. If you park your car outside the church and travel through a short trail overgrown with grass and vines, you'll eventually stumble upon a playground, with a metal slide, a swing set, a merry-go-round, and park benches, all still in mostly working condition. But it hasn't been used in decades. The playground doesn't belong to the church. In fact, no one can actually say for certain who built the playground, or even when. It's just always been there. And the story only gets stranger from there because, well, of course it does. The playground is supposed to be haunted. Adventure seekers and paranormal investigators claim to have caught pictures of phantom orbs or heard the sounds of children's laughter carried on the wind when standing in the site. Vicksburg gained a lot of notoriety in 2014 too, when local paranormal investigator David Childs made an interesting report. Childs says he was walking through the playground with his ghost hunting equipment, hoping to find evidence of these alleged ghost children that haunt the place, when he saw something running between the trees. He said it stood upright like a person, but it had a thick gray coat of fur all over its body. The year after that, a man named Peyton Lassiter was walking along Wisconsin Avenue when he saw some strange tracks that he couldn't identify as being a man or an animal, and so he took some plaster casts. The next day, all of the local newspapers were reporting on the story of the quote-unquote Bigfoot that lived in the haunted playground. But my favorite spooky Easter egg, hands down, would have to be Joe Gerache's Voodoo Shop. There's an antique store on Clay Street in the downtown area of Vicksburg, and if you walk up the grand staircase to the second floor of the shop, you'll pass by a table dedicated to magic. It's covered with black and white candles, incense powders, good luck oils, and pamphlets on how to cast magic spells. If you keep walking, you'll find a large, heavy wooden sign propped up against the wall that says, Corner Drugstore. But what's more interesting is what's on the back of the sign. 3 alchemical symbols, nailed into the wood that customers would have seen as they walked out of the store. This sign used to belong to a local pharmacist named Joe Gerache, who owned a drugstore on the corner of Washington Street. Joe was a collector of sorts, with a penchant towards the strange. He would read books on Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, and according to his own account, kept an actual voodoo doll in his shop. Oh, and those candles and incense and oils that you were looking at a second ago, they all would have been sold right in Mr. Gerache's drugstore. Mr. Gerache also gave a speech on voodoo culture in the Deep South, where he noted that as far back as the 50s, residents of Vicksburg would stop by his store all the time to pick up ingredients for their good luck charms and gree-gree bags. Practicing voodoo was a big part of Vicksburg's culture apparently, and Joe Gerache took care of everyone's needs. The antique store has the last remaining copy of the transcript of this speech, or at least they did. Over the course of writing this episode, I discovered that Adolph Ross's Antiques was in the process of closing down their store. Everything in their store had to go, and so for $125, I managed to take home the entire Joe Gerache voodoo collection. The pamphlets, the oils, the incense, the spells, and yes, the corner drugstore sign. I now have them all stored away in my own personal collection, the newest addition to my own cabinet of curiosities, and one that I'm admittedly very proud of. It probably goes without saying that this episode is unlike any other episode I'll ever make. This one has a very special place in my heart because, well, everything I've told you about today, I've experienced firsthand. I've touched that strange corner drugstore sign with my own hands and spent hours in the local library trying to decipher its symbols. I've visited Cedar Grove for a school field trip, and I've spent the night in the Duff Mansion hunting ghosts with my friends. And I spent an entire afternoon in Cedar Hill Cemetery searching for a tombstone with the picture of a camel on it. I've gone on nighttime drives trying to see the ghostly Confederate soldiers marching along Goldwall Road, and I've hunted Bigfoot at the haunted playground on Wisconsin Avenue. I've spent so much of my life here, walking among the tombstones of Confederate soldiers and visiting spooky antebellum homes, searching for something that may or may not even be there. I know Vicksburg inside and out, so believe me when I tell you that Vicksburg is a city that belongs to the dead. Their presence looms over the town like a shadow. You can all but taste the melancholy in the air, and you can just barely hear the cannons being fired overhead, and you can feel the spirits of dead soldiers brushing past you as you walk down the street, along brick roads that are still illuminated by candlelight. Suffice to say, ghosts or no ghosts, Vicksburg can only properly be described as haunted. Now, we're not done with Vicksburg just yet. No, I have one last ghost story that I want to tell you before we can finally say goodbye to this spooky old town. But that ghost story is so long, it deserves its very own episode. Because among all the haunted houses in Vicksburg, there are none more old, more tragic, or more haunted than the old McRaven House. The Legend Has It podcast is researched, written, and produced by me, Michael Walker, with recording and editing assistance from Nicole Tomplet. All music and sound effects in this episode come from freesound.com, and all links can be found in the description along with the sources cited. I would personally like to thank the staff at the Duff Mansion, as well as the Hughes family, who helped me research the segment on the Cedar Grove Mansion, and are also the descendants of John Alexander Klein. While I'm saying thank you, I want to send a shout out to my pal Tristan for supporting us over on Anchor. Also, I want to thank my buddy Nate Brislin of the Association for Cryptozoological Fieldwork and Analysis Group on Facebook. My pal Nate's been letting me use his page to post whenever we have a new episode out, and I just want you to know, Nate, I'm so grateful that you would give us a home to share our episodes. I'll be putting a link to the ACFA Facebook group in the description. Also, I ask that you guys please remember to like and subscribe, leave a comment or a review, and you can follow us on Instagram at Legend Has It Pod and listen to our episodes on Anchor, Spotify, and YouTube. And I'm happy to announce that the Legend Has It podcast now has a Patreon. We've got cool little monthly perks on there, including shoutouts, art, maybe some Dungeons & Dragons homebrew. There's going to be some real groovy stuff on there, and it would really help support the podcast, so please go check us out. Link, as with everything else, will be in the description. And, like I said at the end of the episode, don't forget to come see us in a few weeks when we go over the full history of the old McRaven house. It's going to be a good one, so stay tuned, and thanks for listening.